I'm Virginia Marshall. I'm the audio producer at Brooklyn Public Library.
And I'm Adwoa Adusei. I'm a librarian here at Brooklyn Public Library and co-host of the podcast. All right. So Bard and Band, as you see, tells the story of America's ideological war with its bookshelves. That is our tagline. We like it a lot. Over the course of 10 episodes, we tell a series of stories from all across the nation. The podcast ran from October to December of 2023. And in almost all of the episodes, there's a focus on how book bans affect the lives and works of teens, of parents, of teachers and librarians. But then the listeners will also hear the legal history and the current history-making events around book bans, and really try to focus on the impact of the laws or governing bodies, whether they be school boards or library boards, how those laws and governing bodies are actually impacting people's lives. And so we're going to play a clip from the first episode, All for a Library, where we hear from Summer Boimier, a high school teacher in Norman, Oklahoma, who makes a QR code accessible to her students that has a full list of often banned books.
The first day of school. It's a day that looms large in our lives. The day you get to start fresh, a clean slate, year after year. And Summer Boimier has had her fair share of them. She's been teaching English in Oklahoma public schools for about a decade. Still, meeting a whole new class of students can be daunting. So, year after year, Summer begins with a signature opening line.
Lasagna is a sandwich. There is not a single soul in any of my classes, really, that has ever agreed with me. And they are incredibly eager to prove me wrong.
In August 2022, Summer was about to meet a new class of 10th graders at Norman High School in Norman, Oklahoma. It was time for a new year of reading and research papers and controversial food opinions. But this year felt different. For the first time, Summer approached that first day of school with trepidation. A law had been passed in Oklahoma, and it targeted what could be taught in schools. The law prohibits anything that could cause someone to, quote, feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any form of psychological distress on account of his or her race or sex. That could include teaching about racism or having books in the curriculum that center LGBTQ+ characters.
The fact that the law is so vague is what makes it so dangerous. It's called HB 1775.
House Bill 1775.
House Bill 1775.
And over the summer, the state of Oklahoma began to enforce it. In July 2022, the state downgraded the accreditation of 2 school districts, Tulsa and Mustang, based on perceived HB 1775 violations.
2 school districts saw their accreditations downgraded for breaking the rules.
And some teachers worry the law will impact how they teach about race-related events in our state's history.
People were scared. I mean, if you're an administrator, a superintendent, for instance, in district, you're between a rock and a hard place. How do you support your teachers? How do you keep your district open?
Accreditation is super important in schools. It gives high schools good standing on college applications, and it ensures big pockets of funding. So this ruling was an alarm bell for schools across the state. HB 1775 targeted the books in school libraries too, even the books that English teachers put on their classroom shelves, which they often pay for out of their own pockets. Teachers do this to supplement the school's curriculum.
Classroom libraries can be an opportunity to expand, right, those stories that we prioritize in our classrooms, which tends to be outdated, very white, very male, heterosexual, cisgender. It really does speak to a very narrow section of the population.
Even though HB 1775 didn't include a specific list of books that teachers had to remove from their classrooms, the general fear of losing funding and reputation were too big to ignore. So, just a few days before the start of the school year in 2022, administrators at Norman High School called a department meeting. It was a meeting Summer will never forget.
So we were advised essentially to vet our classroom libraries as if we hadn't been doing that all along, and pull any books that we thought might violate the law. The directive was restrict or remove student access. If you're not sure, remove access entirely. I have been in many a department meeting before. It's not, as we say back home, it was not my first rodeo. I have never seen teachers cry. I saw that. Because we all know, right? We're all experts in the field. We know that's wrong. We know that's censorship, and we know the slippery slope, right, that creates.
Summer saw teachers boxing up their classroom libraries. Some teachers turned the spines inward so the titles couldn't be seen. But Summer couldn't make herself do either of those things. She was angry.
I'm not going to take books out of my classroom because they center members of the LGBTQ plus community. I'm not going to take books out of my classroom because a Black author wrote this. And that's what the law is asking us to do.
So Summer decided to take a stand. And her stand made that first day of school also her last.
I could not do my job and follow that law as well. So I did it. And I would do it again. I would. I know my students. And it's worth it.
Book bans are nothing new. They've been a part of America's narrative for about as long as our country has existed.
But just in the first half of this year, the American Library Association recorded nearly 2,000 challenges to unique titles. That's the highest number in over 20 years. Censorship is on the rise.
From Brooklyn Public Library, this is Borrowed and Banned, a podcast series that tells the story of America's ideological war with its bookshelves. I'm Adwoa Adusei, librarian at BPL.
And I'm Virginia Marshall, BPL's audio producer. Together, Adwoa and I are going to bring you 7 episodes that tell the story of the teachers and librarians whose livelihoods are endangered when they speak up, the writers whose books have become political battleground, and the young people fighting for intellectual freedom.
With every episode of Borrowed and Banned, we'll share steps you can take to combat censorship, no matter how old you are. To start off, we're looking at what happened in one Oklahoma town when their freedom to read was challenged, and how one teacher's response caught the nation's attention.
Okay, that was the beginning of our first episode. And I should say that's Summer there in the photograph. Do you want to talk a little bit about how the series came together, Adwoa?
Yes, sure. I still get chills listening to that episode. Also, the production was just, so very well done, Virginia. So the series, Borrowed and Banned, sort of grew out of BPL's own flagship podcast series called Borrowed. Borrowed has existed since 2019. And in late May of 2022, we produced an episode about the Books Unbanned initiative. It's a regular episode, I think maybe 20 minutes or so. But we realized that there was something in the episode and that it could be expanded upon. So to backtrack, Books Unbanned was begun in April of 2022. So it's about 2 years old. And it was a program or an initiative created by our chief librarian and a team of other librarians and youth leaders in response to the rise in book bans across the country. And so what it is a free e-card lending program where we give out-of-state teens access to our ebook collection, which is like over 500,000 ebooks and audio files. And a lot of the items are banned books. So in that first episode, we interviewed BPL staff, we also interviewed teens who were participating in the initiative and had also become a part of the inaugural Teen Freedom to Read Council. And at the time of the initiative, it'd been happening for maybe a month or two at that point. There were over 4,000 e-cards that were made. Their inbox was constantly full, 5,000 plus people writing in to either show support or give praise. And there was a lot of media attention as well. And I will say that in the last 2 years, at least 4 other library systems have joined on to the Books Unbanned initiative. So there was fire there. There was something happening. And we realized, like I said, that we could do a whole dedicated series on it. And so we realized, though, that in order to do that, we had 7 episode ideas, and then we added 3 bonus episodes talking with writers. We needed help in production. We needed help in beyond our team, which is just a small group of librarians, and then Virginia as the sole audio producer. So we had an idea, but we needed backing and support to execute it.
Yeah, thank you. And to pick up where Adwoa left off, so I think part of what Books Unbanned, within the first year, there was, as Adwoa said, a lot of attention. There were news stories about it. There were people across the country, teens across the country, signing up for this library card. But the team at the library and sort of our patrons and national patrons as well, what they were looking for was kind of information about why and how these book bans were happening. And I think that's sort of where we came in and thought this is how a podcast series could help further that, the goal of just having people across the country know that reading what you want, when you want, wherever you want is a good thing, and trying to protect that freedom. So that's also another way into the podcast series, or the motivation behind wanting to create something that was comprehensive and something that showed a bird's eye view, but also a personal view on how and why these book bans are occurring across the country. So as Adwoa mentioned, we had all of these ideas. We did lots of research to kind of try to have one episode about each way in which these book bans were playing out, because it's happening in so many different ways, right? There's bans that come from school boards. There are bans that come from state laws, as you heard in the episode with Summer Boismier, her reaction, which we didn't get to it in that part of the episode, but what she does is she ends up posting a QR code that links to the Books Unbanned program on her covered up bookshelves in her library. So instead of taking books off of her shelves that violate the state's idea of what is making students uncomfortable, she decided in protest to kind of cover them all up and say, here's a library, you can use this program or not, but you should read what you want. And that was what motivated her eventually to resign from being a teacher in Oklahoma, because there was just a lot of pushback from her administration. So anyway, these book bans are happening in so many different ways. And so we wanted to create a series that talked about the different ways they're happening and ways that people are fighting back, both young people and also just members of the community who are trying to protect libraries. So we went about it in a couple of ways. It's kind of interesting that this project evolved from, we initially put together a description of all the episodes and approached podcast networks, because if you have a great idea, there's a chance that Apple Podcasts or Spotify or iHeartMedia will fund that idea. And particularly what we needed was a production company to help us make this series sound really great. We have a story to tell, we can get in touch with participants, but there's that extra piece of really great storytelling that shows listeners hey, this is something you should pay attention to. And it's something we're putting resources into because it's important. But we got some really interesting reactions from these podcasting networks. One of them was you should do a whole series on just one book, D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover. Let's have 10 episodes about that. And I think as a reaction, we were well, that's interesting. And maybe I would listen to that, but that's not what is happening now and what feels important. what feels important is like these attacks on LGBTQ plus rights, on like Black authors, on authors of color, in this like, and it's related to what's happening in national politics, right? It's like a big story. So that was one interesting reaction. And then another piece of feedback we got from some of the networks was that it's too political and they didn't want to touch it. So we then like shifted and we were like, at that point, I should say too, that we had started working with a production company called Goat Rodeo. We found some money in our marketing department, like within BPL, and paid them to help us make that first episode, which we were then using to pitch to all of these networks. So that's what you heard in the beginning and why it sounds so great. Like I did some of it, but mostly it was the production company that made that sound like so professional. And so we were left with like all of these no's essentially from big companies, either saying you're not doing it the right way or it's too political. And so we at the library were like, well, we want to make it anyway. You know, like we have this small team. How can we make this happen? And this is when Metro's Equity and Action Grant like swooped in and really helped us continue this vision. I think I really like when I read the description of the grant, I really responded to it because I think it like shares a lot of the goals of this series and of Brooklyn Public Library as a whole, right? To like focus on marginalized communities, to uplift and share those stories. And so we applied. We already had like a company we wanted to work with and an idea. And we were just like hoping that Metro believed in it too. And they did, which was so lucky for us because that then allowed us to keep working with Goat Rodeo to, they didn't like do the audio production for the rest of the series, but there was a producer who was listening to all the drafts and providing feedback on sound design, on a little bit of the scripting, just making sure that we were telling the stories in like a really professional and polished way. So yeah, it just felt like a story where we were going to do it anyway. And like, thankfully, we got support from Metro in order to do it in a really good way. And we've had a lot of success. At its peak, there were 8,000 people across the world listening to this podcast, which is, I mean, it's not This American Life, but it's like huge for Brooklyn Public Library and for this kind of story. We were really lucky to receive like a number of awards. We won a Webby Award for Best Writing in a Podcast. We were nominated for a Peabody Award, which is still crazy to me, like really exciting, but wild. But I think it both speaks to like the quality of the show, but more importantly, the urgency of the story. I think we heard back from like all of the young people that we, or many of the young people that we talked to, who said that they felt like their stories were really well handled. They felt that they learned things from other episodes, like about the history of censorship, about how censorship is happening in a different state that's not theirs. Because we talked about Texas, we talked about, as you heard, Oklahoma, but also Pennsylvania and Louisiana and all these different places. And then I've heard from teachers as well who said like they used it as a jumping off point to create a curriculum for their students to talk about book bans. So those are the ways in which we felt like the story we wanted to tell was like reaching the right ears.
So yeah, Virginia selected 2 episodes that we could listen in on, get more goosebumps potentially about the quality. The first episode is Seen and Obscene, or rather the second episode in the series is Seen and Obscene, where we're delving into the history of obscenity laws, which are at the root of, you know, America's obsession really with banning books that are deemed sexually explicit. And we go into the history of what happens, like how that happens, those labels occur. And then also we're talking with young adults who are, like Virginia said, fighting for the freedom to read and fighting against those laws. And then also surprising connections to Brooklyn, the history of obscenity laws. And then I can introduce the 5th episode after the clip, I guess.
Yeah, sounds good. So we'll hear from Cameron Samuels first, and I'll just say this is Cameron. They are actually testifying in front of Congress in this photo, so that's just pretty cool.
Education has always been so important to me, where in kindergarten, I asked my classmates, why couldn't we have school year-round? I loved school, and I still very much do.
This is Cameron Samuels. Now Cameron is a college student in Massachusetts, but they spent their entire K-12 education in the suburbs west of Houston, Texas, at Katy Independent School District, or Katy ISD.
Katy had amazing schools. It was a destination school district, and it was for a while until recently.
When Cameron entered high school, they started to encounter challenges, specifically an internet filter that prevented them from visiting LGBTQ+ resources on the web while at school. Websites like The Trevor Project and The Advocate, a news site covering LGBTQ issues.
I was shocked. It was unfathomable to me that the district had a category called Alternative Sexual Lifestyles, and in parentheses, GLBT, that justified blocking websites that provided crucial resources to queer youth like myself. I noticed the filter my freshman year of high school, and it wasn't until my senior year that I went to the school board.
At this time, the Board of Trustees will give members of the public an opportunity to speak in accordance with Katy ISD Board Policy BED Local.
If you've never been to a school board meeting, imagine a fluorescently lit room with a tall wooden bench at the front. Board members, mostly wearing suits, sit behind the bench. There's a podium facing the board members, and behind the podium, rows of chairs for the public. School board meetings are open to everyone. Anyone can register to speak about any topic at the podium for 3 minutes.
Speaking at the end of your 3 minutes, your audio will turn off. The speakers
This is a recording from a school board meeting in Katy, Texas, in November 2021. It was there that Cameron brought up the internet filter for the first time.
I want to bring to light a disturbing discovery that several students and I have found. Katy ISD has an internet filter policy based on... The school board room has about 200 seats. When a speaker walks back to their seat, the room is typically in a roar of applause. But whenever I went up to speak and walked back to my seat, not a single clap was made. And I just saw people staring at me. As the only student, I felt like I wasn't being heard.
Cameron wasn't the only person to speak at the board meeting that day in November. 6 women, many of them mothers of children in the school district, read explicit excerpts from young adult books they said were in school libraries and called for their immediate removal.
We need your help in an immediate plan of action to clean up the obscene, vulgar, and pornographic books that are currently in Katy ISD libraries.
I'm reading from Forever for a Year by B.T. Godfrey.
Pornographic materials for our students in our schools. I will read from the following book called All Boys Aren't.
I have never read such vulgar, explicit material until now, and I expect immediate action, including an audit of our libraries.
The next speaker is Anita Nelson. The speaker after that is Karen.
What happened in Katy, Texas is not an isolated event. Across the country, school boards are becoming places where books are labeled pornographic, where librarians and teachers are accused of pedophilia and indoctrination.
School libraries could be put on notice if a student ends up with a book deemed to have obscene material.
Librarians could be held criminally responsible if the content they're using in schools is considered obscene.
These challenges have a focus. According to PEN America, which tracks banned and challenged materials in schools, 40% of the more than 1,600 titles banned in the 2021-2022 school year contained LGBTQ+ characters and themes.
The reasons cited for these challenges? That the books are, quote, obscene, pornographic, or vulgar. Similar language to what you just heard at the Katy ISD school board meeting.
All of this made us wonder, who gets to say what's obscene and what's not? Because in Katy, the parents and school board members seemed to be the ones making those calls.
The following day after the board meeting, they listened to all the parents that were there calling books sexual and pornographic, and they removed those books from school libraries within 24 hours of that meeting.
To be clear, we at BPL respect the right of parents to choose what their own kids read, but we won't remove access for all because of the demands of a few.
We've seen what happens when censorship reigns. We've been here before. On this episode, we're going to track America's relationship with obscene material to the present day. I'm Virginia Marshall.
And I'm Adwoa Adusei. From Brooklyn Public Library, this is Borrowed and Banned, a podcast series that tells the story of America's ideological war with its bookshelves.
Thank you, Virginia. Before we go to the next episode, I just want to say that, also without this grant, right, the access to the sound library and some of these things that you're hearing, we might not have gotten a chance to have in there. I don't know if you're going to talk about that later, but again, that it gets you into a headspace. The production quality that we got to do because of the Metro grant. So the next episode is Beloved Blues, where we dive into Toni Morrison's place in the American literary canon and how her works are continually on banned books list, even going so far to be at the center of a censorship campaign during a 2021 gubernatorial race in Virginia. So we spoke with a Morrison scholar, Professor Dana Williams. We spoke with a writer, George M. Johnson, whose book is also often on banned list, and with a young adult, all about the impact of Morrison's words.
The thought that leads me to contemplate with dread the erasure of other voices, of unwritten novels, poems whispered, swallowed for fear of being overheard by the wrong people, outlawed languages flourishing underground, essayists' questions challenging authority never being posed, unstaged plays, canceled films. That's a nightmare. It's as though a whole universe was being described in invisible ink. A writer's life and work are not a gift to mankind. A writer's life and work are its necessity. Thank you. Thank you.
That was Toni Morrison, speaking in 2008 when she accepted the Literary Service Award from PEN America, and the audio comes to us courtesy of PEN America. Morrison is a Presidential Medal of Freedom awardee and recipient of both a Nobel and a Pulitzer Prize.
To add to that impressive list of accolades, we'll also say that Toni Morrison was a stalwart crusader against censorship. Up until she passed away in 2019, she spoke and wrote often about the dangers of book bans, and she edited a collection of essays about the importance of intellectual freedom in schools and public libraries.
Morrison knows about censorship firsthand. Her novels have been among the most frequently banned and challenged in America. Her first novel, The Bluest Eye, published in 1970, is a constant fixture on those lists, along with Beloved, which was published in 1987.
Last episode, we talked about why and how books get that classic label and what that does for those books. Despite the fact that Morrison's novels are considered literary canon and are widely read in high schools and colleges worldwide, her books are still being challenged and banned. Most recently, attempts to ban Beloved have been used to galvanize conservative political campaigns not only at school boards, but at the highest level of state.
In 2021, Glenn Youngkin, then Republican candidate for Virginia governor, ran a campaign ad featuring a Virginia parent who was upset that her son read Beloved in an AP English literature course his senior year of high school. She petitioned the state to restrict access to the book back in 2016, and the bill made it to the governor's desk, only to be vetoed. Youngkin resurfaced that story in 2021 as an appeal to voters.
As a parent, it's tough to catch everything. So when my son showed me his reading assignment, my heart sunk. It was some of the most explicit material you can imagine.
Youngkin presented himself as the politician who would ban the books that some parents objected to. He wanted to tap into a growing movement for, quote, parental rights in education. And it worked. The ad caught national attention.
There's been a firestorm in the Virginia race over the teaching of Toni Morrison's Beloved.
Republican candidate Glenn Youngkin says the book should be banned, and parents want it.
Even the president weighed in when he campaigned in support of Youngkin's Democratic opponent, Terry McAuliffe.
He's gone from banning a woman's right to choose to banning books written by a Pulitzer Prize and Nobel Prize winning author Toni Morrison.
Glenn Youngkin won. He's now governor of Virginia, and just months into his term, he resurrected the so-called Beloved Bill from 2016 and signed it into law. That law, also referred to as HB 516 and then SB 656, regulates books in schools that could be considered, quote, explicit. Under this new law, parents have oversight over what their child reads as part of the curriculum, and teachers must provide alternative text to anything that the parent objects to.
Many have argued that the so-called Beloved Bill is a slippery slope on the way to censorship. In our conversations with writers and activists over the course of this series, many of them have pointed to this moment, this governor's race in Virginia, as the start of the recent and unprecedented rise in book bans. For many, this was a turning point.
As Morrison herself pointed out in her 2008 Pen America speech, censorship affects not only books by marginalized voices of the past and present, but can also stifle the creation of future work, those universes that can then only be described in invisible ink. In this episode, we look at the impact of Morrison's words and their staying power, and we'll also investigate the importance of writing to those most impacted by censorship. I'm Adwoa Adusei.
And I'm Virginia Marshall. You're listening to Borrowed and Banned, a podcast series about America's ideological war with its bookshelves. Okay. And then the rest of the episode is, as Adwoa said, it includes George M. Johnson, whose picture you see here as well, the author of All Boys Aren't Blue. Do you want to say anything more, Adwoa, about that? You were the writer on that episode.
Not really, just that it was intimidating to try to synthesize Toni Morrison, but it was made easier by Professor Dana Williams, who you heard, and then George M. Johnson, who was also interviewed for a separate bonus episode, and then the young adult that we interviewed at the end. So that helped make the episode what it is.
Yeah. And that's the end of our presentation. We have more clips that we could play if any of you want to hear more. But yeah.